A question about money. Have you ever loved someone so much that you avoided one simple word, money, because you were afraid it might break everything? I did. 4 weeks ago in the United States, standing in a quiet kitchen with the heater humming like it was tired too, I realized something uncomfortable. Love doesn't disappear because of money, but silence does. This video is not just about English, or marriage, or America. It's about that moment when you're exhausted, learning a new language, adapting to a new country, and wondering if love can survive a conversation you've been avoiding. I want you to imagine this. You move to a new country, with hope packed tighter than your suitcase. You tell yourself, I'll learn English slowly. I'll figure life out. But real life in America doesn't wait for your grammar to improve. Bills arrive on time. Weather changes without asking. People talk fast. And money talks even faster. During my first weeks in the US, the climate surprised me more than I expected. Mornings were cold and dry, evenings suddenly warm. My body needed time to adjust, but my mind didn't get that luxury. Every change demanded attention. Heating costs, grocery prices, gas, rent. All those numbers floating around my head, while I was still translating basic thoughts into English like, is this expensive, or can we afford this? Here's the strange part. I was practicing English every day. Simple sentences. Slow listening. Reading signs, menus, receipts. But emotionally, I was stuck. Because every time money came up, my chest tightened. Not because we were poor. Not because there was a crisis. But because money had become the symbol of everything I was afraid of failing at, in a new country, in a new language, in a marriage far from familiar support. In many cultures, especially where I come from, talking about money in love feels impolite. Like you're measuring affection with numbers. But in the US, I noticed something different. People talk about money early. Calmly. Sometimes awkwardly, but openly. It's not romance killing here. It's responsibility. And my brain didn't like that at all. Psychologically, this makes sense. When you're under stress, new language, new environment, climate change, cultural shock, your brain goes into survival mode. Neuroscience calls this cognitive overload. Your brain prioritizes safety, not romance. Money equals safety. So even a small conversation about spending can feel like a threat. Basically, your nervous system is overreacting, like a smoke alarm going off, because you made toast. That week, I noticed my English practice changing. I avoided speaking when topics felt heavy. I stuck to safe words. Weather. Food. How are you? But real communication doesn't live there. Real-life English lives in discomfort. In sentences like, we need to talk about our budget. Or, this makes me nervous. One night, after a long day, my partner casually asked something simple. Should we save more this month? The sentence was calm. Neutral. Grammatically easy. Emotionally, it hit like a storm. My mind raced. Does this mean I'm not enough? Am I failing here? And just like that, our first fight in America quietly began, not with shouting, but with misunderstanding. This is where English learning becomes real. Because language is not about perfect pronunciation. It's about expressing fear without attacking. It's about saying, I feel worried, instead of staying silent. Studies in language acquisition show that emotional engagement improves memory retention. When you attach feelings to words, you remember them longer. That night, I learned more English than from any textbook, because I felt it. I realized something important, and maybe you need to hear this too. If you're losing motivation to learn English, it's not because you're lazy. It's because you're tired. Your brain is protecting you. But avoiding difficult topics slows both language growth and emotional connection. Talking slowly, simply, honestly, that's the bridge. So I did something small. The next day, I practiced one sentence. Just one. Out loud. Slowly. Can we talk about money without fighting? No fancy vocabulary. No perfect tense. Just truth. Simple English. Real life. And that's what this story is really about. Learning English through moments that matter. Through climate changes that force you indoors. Through cultural differences that challenge your habits. Through love that doesn't break, but bends, learns, and grows stronger when you finally let the words come out. If you're watching this and feeling stuck, emotionally or linguistically, remember this. You don't need better English to face real life. You need real life to make your English better. Money was just the trigger. Communication was the lesson. New life, new climate. Imagine waking up one morning and not trusting the air anymore. You look outside, the sky is bright, the sun looks friendly, but the cold slips under your jacket. Like it knows you personally. That was my second week in America. New life, new climate, and somehow, my emotions changed with the weather. Back home, weather had patterns I understood. Seasons behaved politely. In the US, especially where I was living, the climate felt moody. One day dry and freezing, the next warm enough to make you doubt your memory. Scientists say climate affects mood because temperature shifts influence cortisol levels, the stress hormone. I didn't know the science then. I just knew I felt uneasy, like my body arrived before my confidence did. This matters more than you think when you're learning English. Because your brain loves stability. Familiar sounds. Predictable routines. But suddenly, nothing was familiar. Even choosing clothes became a decision that cost energy. And energy, when limited, disappears first from learning motivation. Every morning, I tried to keep a routine. Coffee. Notebook. One short English paragraph. But my thoughts wandered. Heating bills crossed my mind. Why was the heater running so much? Why was electricity more expensive than I expected? Climate in America isn't just about comfort, it's about money. Cold means heating. Heat means air conditioning. And both mean numbers quietly adding up. Here's where culture sneaks in. In the US, people talk openly about utility costs, insulation, energy efficiency. It's normal. Practical. But for me, every mention of cost felt like pressure. Not because anyone blamed me, but because I blamed myself. My English wasn't fast enough to keep up with these conversations, so my brain filled the gaps with anxiety. There's a psychological effect called uncertainty stress. When you don't fully understand your environment, your brain stays alert longer than it should. That constant alertness makes simple things, like listening in another language, feel exhausting. You're not bad at English. You're overstimulated. One afternoon, it started raining unexpectedly. Heavy rain. Cold rain. The kind that makes the sky feel lower. I stood by the window and realized something quietly sad. I missed knowing what to expect. Weather used to be small talk. Now it was a reminder that I was new here. Still adjusting. Still translating life word by word. That night, I practiced English differently. Instead of forcing vocabulary lists, I described the day out loud. Slowly. Today is cold. The rain is loud. I feel tired. Simple sentences. Honest ones. Research shows that self-relevant language practice increases fluency because it activates emotional memory. Basically, your brain listens more carefully when the story is yours. And then money showed up again, quietly. Wet shoes meant buying another pair. Cold nights meant thicker blankets. Nothing dramatic. Just small costs piling up like drops of rain. My partner mentioned winter preparation casually. No judgment. Just planning. But inside me, a storm brewed. Climate and money were now connected in my head. Cold meant spending. Spending meant stress. This is where many people lose motivation, not just in language learning, but in life changes. They think, I'm not ready. But readiness is a myth. Adaptation is what actually happens. The human brain adapts through exposure, not perfection. So I exposed myself, gently. I listened to slow English videos about weather. Read short articles about American seasons. Learned phrases like layer up, utility bill, energy efficient. Not to sound smart. To feel less lost. Each word removed a tiny piece of fear. Something interesting happened. As I understood the climate better, my emotional temperature dropped. I wasn't calmer because the weather improved. I was calmer because understanding gave me control. Language became a tool again, not a test. Cultural differences hit differently when you're tired. Americans often plan ahead for seasons, financially and emotionally. That planning can feel cold if you come from a place where people rely more on flexibility or shared support. But neither way is wrong. They are responses to environment. Climate shapes culture. Culture shapes communication. Communication shapes relationships. By the end of that week, I realized the climate wasn't my enemy. It was my teacher. It forced conversations. It exposed weak spots. It demanded adjustment. Just like learning English. Just like marriage. If you're learning English through stories like this, pay attention to how environment affects emotion. Notice your body. Cold fingers. Tight shoulders. Shallow breathing. These physical signals influence how well you listen and speak. Take breaks. Speak slowly. Let your nervous system settle before blaming your ability. New life doesn't arrive quietly. It arrives with cold mornings, unexpected bills, unfamiliar words, and emotions that feel bigger than they should. But step by step, sentence by sentence, you find your balance. Not because everything becomes easy, but because you become capable. And that's when I understood. Adapting to America wasn't about surviving the climate. It was about learning to live inside it, with language, with love, and with patience for myself. Culture shock in love. Have you ever realized that love speaks different languages depending on where you are standing? Not English or Vietnamese, or any language you can study from a book, but cultural language. The kind that decides what is polite, what is rude, and what topics should stay quietly hidden. In my third week in the United States, I learned that love here talks about money much earlier than I was emotionally prepared for. Back home, love felt soft around the edges. You show care through actions, not questions. You avoid direct talk about finances because it feels cold, almost transactional. In my mind, love should feel warm, like a blanket, not like a spreadsheet. But America didn't read that rule book. Here, love sits at the table with reality. And reality brings numbers. Culture shock doesn't arrive with fireworks. It sneaks in during normal conversations. A comment about insurance. A casual mention of retirement. A question like, how do we split this? Simple words. Clear grammar. But emotionally, they land differently when your cultural instincts say, this conversation is dangerous. Psychologists describe culture shock as a loss of familiar cues. Your brain expects certain social rhythms, and when they are missing, it feels unbalanced. That imbalance often turns into irritation or defensiveness. Not because the other person is wrong, but because your internal map no longer matches the territory. That week, my English sounded fine on the surface. I could answer questions. I could nod. But inside, I was translating culture, not language. When my partner talked about budgets, I heard doubt. When they talked about planning, I heard pressure. None of that was actually said. My brain filled the silence with fear. This is where learning English through stories matters. Because language learners don't just memorize words, they absorb values. In the US, directness is often seen as respect. Avoiding money talk can feel irresponsible, not romantic. That idea took time to settle in my nervous system. One evening, we sat together after dinner. No arguing. Just quiet. And then came a sentence that changed everything. I want us to feel safe, not stressed. Simple English. Short words. But the meaning cut through my assumptions. This wasn't about control. It was about care. Neuroscience tells us that emotional misunderstanding activates the amygdala, the brain's threat detector. Once it's activated, listening quality drops. You hear tone instead of content. That explains why my English comprehension disappeared during emotional conversations, even when the vocabulary was easy. My brain wasn't failing at language. It was protecting my heart. So I tried something different. Instead of defending, I asked. Slowly. Carefully. What does money mean to you? That question felt risky. Vulnerable. But it opened a door. I learned that for my partner, money meant stability in a system where healthcare, housing, and future planning are deeply connected to finances. In America, love doesn't replace systems. It works within them. This realization softened something in me. Culture shock stopped feeling like an attack and started feeling like information. Data my brain needed to update its expectations. Culture isn't about right or wrong. It's about adaptation. From a language learning perspective, this was powerful. I started practicing emotional sentences. Not dramatic ones. Honest ones. This is new for me. I need time to understand. Can we talk slowly? Research shows that using emotionally authentic language improves confidence and reduces speaking anxiety. When you stop performing and start communicating, fluency follows. I also noticed how American culture separates emotion from practicality more cleanly. You can love deeply and still talk about money logically. That separation felt strange at first. Like splitting one heart into two compartments. But slowly, I saw the benefit. When money talk is clear, it doesn't leak into affection. When it's avoided, it poisons silence. That week, I stopped seeing money conversations as threats to love. I started seeing them as maintenance. Like checking the weather before a trip. Not romantic, but necessary if you want to arrive safely. Together. Culture shock in love doesn't mean love is weaker. It means love is learning. Learning new rules. New signals. New emotional grammar. Just like learning English. If you're listening to this and feeling confused in your own relationships, especially across cultures, remember this: discomfort is information. It's your brain saying, this is unfamiliar. Not, this is wrong. Slow down. Ask questions. Use simple words. Let meaning arrive before judgment. By the end of that week, I wasn't fluent in American culture. But I was less afraid of it. And fear, once reduced, gives space for language to grow. For love to breathe. For conversations about money to become conversations about care. That's when I realized, culture shock didn't weaken our relationship. Avoiding it would have. Talking through it, slowly, honestly, in imperfect English, made us stronger than before. When English felt heavy. Have you ever felt tired before the day even started? Like your brain woke up already carrying a backpack full of rocks? That's how English felt to me in week 4. Not difficult. Heavy. The words weren't complicated. The grammar wasn't new. But everything inside me resisted speaking, listening, even thinking in English. It was like my mind quietly said, not today. This was the point where many people quit. Not loudly. Not dramatically. They don't announce it. They just stop trying. They tell themselves they'll continue tomorrow. And tomorrow becomes next month. What made it worse was that nothing was wrong. Life in the US was stable. The weather was manageable. My relationship hadn't exploded. But inside, I felt drained. English wasn't just a language anymore. It felt like another responsibility. Another bill to pay with energy I didn't have. Psychologists call this emotional fatigue. When your brain spends too long adapting, new culture, new climate, new expectations, it runs low on dopamine, the chemical that fuels motivation. Learning slows down not because you're incapable, but because your reward system is exhausted. Your brain says, why bother? I noticed this especially during conversations at home. Simple English sentences felt sharp. Even neutral phrases like let's plan or we should think about. This made my shoulders tense. My listening skills dropped. I asked people to repeat themselves, not because I didn't hear, but because my brain lagged behind my ears. And here's the painful irony. This is exactly when English practice matters most. But it's also when it feels least possible. That week, I stopped doing productive English. No lists. No goals. No pressure. Instead, I did something small and almost silly. I talked to myself. Out loud. Slowly. About how tired I was. I feel tired today. English feels heavy. I don't want to speak, but I will try. This matters because language is processed differently when emotion is involved. Studies in psycholinguistics show that naming emotions reduces their intensity. When you put a feeling into words, even simple ones, you activate the prefrontal cortex, which calms the stress response. In other words, saying, I'm overwhelmed, actually helps your brain relax. At the same time, my marriage entered a quiet phase. Not distant. Just subdued. We were both adjusting. Different pressures. Different internal clocks. And money, still there, like background noise. Not loud enough to fight about, but present enough to remind us that life here required constant awareness. One evening, my partner spoke gently about future plans. Not demands. Not criticism. Just thoughts. Normally, this would be fine. But that night, my English felt too slow for my emotions. I understood the words, but not fast enough to respond comfortably. Silence filled the gap. Silence can feel peaceful, or dangerous. In that moment, it felt like failure. I thought, if I were better at English, this would be easier. That thought is a trap many learners fall into. We blame language when the real issue is energy. Language learning is physical. Your brain uses glucose. Attention consumes resources. When you're depleted, even familiar tasks feel hard. That doesn't mean you're regressing. It means you're human. So instead of forcing conversation, I named the feeling. Slowly. My brain is tired. Not poetic. Not elegant. But honest. And honesty changes dynamics. The pressure eased. No argument. No misunderstanding. Just space. This taught me something important for English learners. You don't always need better words. You need permission to speak imperfectly. In the US, especially in close relationships, clarity matters more than fluency. Saying, "I'm tired," is better than staying silent with perfect grammar in your head. That week, I changed how I practiced listening to. I chose slower content, familiar topics, stories, not information. Neuroscience shows that narrative-based learning reduces cognitive load because your brain predicts structure. Stories feel lighter than facts. That's why this format works, for language and for healing motivation. I also paid attention to my body. Tight jaw, shallow breathing, cold hands. These physical signals interfere with speech production. So I slowed down physically before expecting linguistic performance. Warm drink. Deep breath. Then one sentence. The weight of English didn't disappear overnight. But it shifted. It stopped feeling like a test and started feeling like a tool again. A tool to say, "I'm still here." A tool to connect, even when energy is low. If you're listening to this and feeling that heaviness, let me say this clearly, you are not behind. You are not failing. You are in a phase. A normal, biological phase of adaptation. Don't quit here. Shrink the task. Speak one sentence. Listen for 5 minutes. That's enough to keep the bridge intact. Because language doesn't disappear when you rest. It waits. And slowly, very slowly, the heaviness lifts. Not because English gets easier, but because you stop carrying it alone. Our first real fight. Have you ever argued with someone you love and later realized the fight wasn't really about what you were talking about? That's exactly how our first real fight in America began. Not with shouting. Not with slammed doors. But with a quiet sentence about money that landed on a heart already tired. It happened on an ordinary evening. No dramatic setup. Just 2 people sitting at the table, the house unusually quiet, the outside air cold enough to remind us that winter was still close. My partner said something simple, something practical. A sentence that, on paper, was harmless. About expenses. About planning. About being careful. My English brain understood every word. My emotional brain understood something else entirely. I heard pressure. I heard judgment. I heard fear disguised as logic. And before I could slow myself down, my tone changed. My answers became shorter. My body leaned back, as if preparing for impact. That's how fights really start, not with words, but with posture. Science explains this better than blame ever could. When we feel threatened, even emotionally, the brain shifts control from the rational prefrontal cortex to the limbic system. Listening becomes selective. We stop hearing intent and start hearing danger. That's why, in moments like this, English learners suddenly forget what they know. Stress hijacks language. So when I spoke, my English sounded sharper than I meant. Not rude, but defensive. And defensiveness invites more tension. It's a quiet loop. The strange part is that the fight still felt small. No yelling. No insults. But the emotional weight was heavy. Heavier than the topic deserved. Money wasn't the real issue. Change was. Uncertainty was. And deep down, the fear of not being enough in a new country. In many relationships, the first fight is a shock, because it breaks the illusion of smoothness. You realize love doesn't protect you from conflict. It only gives you a reason to face it. And in a second language, conflict feels riskier. You worry about choosing the wrong words, the wrong tone, the wrong moment. At one point, I stopped talking completely. Silence again. My old habit. Silence felt safer than saying something I might regret in English. But silence has its own language, and it's rarely kind. My partner noticed. Not angrily. Just with concern. And then came a sentence I didn't expect. I'm not fighting you. I'm worried. That sentence slowed everything down. Not because it was complex, but because it named emotion, not logic. Research in relationship psychology shows that labeling feelings reduces conflict intensity. When someone says, I'm worried instead of you should, the brain hears vulnerability, not attack. That was my opening. I took a breath. Literally. Long exhale. Then I spoke slowly, like I was teaching myself English again. Money conversations scare me. Simple subject. Simple verb. Honest content. That one sentence changed the direction of the night. I explained, not perfectly, how money talk in my culture often feels like criticism. How moving to the US made everything feel measured. How learning English while adjusting emotionally made my reactions stronger than my intentions. The grammar wasn't great. The pauses were long. But the message landed. Here's something important for language learners. Meaning travels even when grammar stumbles. Especially in emotional moments. Fluency is not accuracy. Fluency is connection. The fight didn't disappear. We didn't suddenly agree on everything. But it transformed. From confrontation to clarification. From tension to understanding. Money stopped being the enemy. Misinterpretation was. Later that night, I reflected on why this fight mattered so much. It was our first real test in America. Not paperwork. Not climate. Not language exams. But emotional. Negotiation in a shared future. Money just happened to be the doorway. From a learning perspective, this fight taught me more English than weeks of passive listening. I learned phrases I would remember forever, because they were born in emotion. I feel overwhelmed. This is new for me. Can we slow down? Emotional relevance locks language into memory. It also taught me a lesson about motivation. Many people lose motivation to learn English after moments like this, because they associate the language with discomfort. But discomfort is not failure. It's growth knocking without asking permission. The next day, I didn't replay the fight with shame. I replayed it with curiosity. Where did my body react? Where did my words rush? Where could I pause next time? This reflective practice is powerful. It turns experience into progress. Our first real fight didn't damage our relationship. It adjusted it. It revealed where we needed clearer language, not just English, but emotional language. It showed us that love in America required conversations we couldn't avoid forever. And maybe that's the quiet truth behind many conflicts. They aren't signs of breaking. They are signs of entering a deeper level of honesty. If you're learning English and afraid of conflict, remember this: you don't need perfect sentences to repair connection. You need courage to speak slowly, imperfectly, and truthfully. That's enough to turn a fight into a foundation. That night, we didn't win the argument. But we won something better: mutual understanding. And from there, everything else became possible. Money means safety here. Have you ever noticed how one word can carry a completely different weight depending on where you live? In my 6th week of adjusting emotionally to life in America, I finally understood something that had been quietly shaping every conversation we had. Here, money doesn't just mean comfort. It means safety. Back home, safety often came from people. Family nearby. Neighbors who knew your name. Systems that were slower but familiar. In the US, safety feels more structured, more numerical. Health insurance. Emergency savings. Credit scores. Retirement plans. None of these are romantic words, but they sit right next to love at the dinner table. This realization didn't arrive suddenly. It came through observation. Through small comments. Through habits. I noticed how carefully people planned. How casually they talked about financial buffers. How often the future appeared in conversations, even when life felt stable now. At first, this felt cold to me. Calculated. Like love had conditions. But psychologically, this makes sense. In societies where systems replace informal support networks, individuals rely more on financial preparedness. Money becomes a proxy for protection. Not greed. Not control. Just preparedness. Once I saw it that way, my emotional resistance softened. I thought about healthcare for the first time. In a serious way. In America, getting sick isn't just about rest. It's about cost. Coverage. Deductibles. That knowledge changes how people think about money. It adds urgency. It adds caution. Suddenly, a conversation about saving isn't pessimistic, it's caring. This shift in understanding changed how I heard English sentences. Before, phrases like, "we should plan," sounded like pressure. Now, they sounded like concern. Same words. Different meaning. That's how culture works. It redefines vocabulary through values. From a neuroscience perspective, this is reframing. When you change the meaning you attach to a stimulus, your emotional reaction changes. Money stopped triggering fear and started triggering awareness. And awareness is much easier to communicate about than fear. I began practicing English with this new lens. Instead of avoiding financial vocabulary, I leaned into it gently. Not spreadsheets. Not complex terms. Just simple sentences tied to real meaning. This helps me feel safe. I worry about the future. Planning makes me calm. These sentences weren't just language practice. They were emotional alignment. Interestingly, my listening improved. 2. When you're not emotionally defensive, comprehension increases. Studies show that anxiety reduces auditory processing efficiency. Once my fear around money decreased, my English suddenly felt clearer. Not because the language changed, but because my nervous system relaxed. This had an unexpected effect on our relationship. Conversations became shorter but deeper. We didn't circle topics anymore. We named them. Slowly. Respectfully. Money stopped being a symbol of conflict and became a shared responsibility. Something external we could face together. I also noticed how American culture teaches children early about money as a life skill. Not a taboo. Not a secret. This shapes adults who can separate emotional worth from financial planning. That separation was new to me. But it was freeing. Love didn't disappear when numbers appeared. It stood beside them. For English learners, this is an important lesson. Language reflects culture. When you learn words without understanding values, confusion grows. But when you connect vocabulary to lived experience, fluency feels natural. Words stick because they matter. That week, I reflected on why money conversations hurt so much at first. They touched my identity, my sense of contribution, my fear of dependency. These are universal human concerns, amplified by migration and language barriers. Once I acknowledged that, shame loosened its grip. I practiced one small habit that helped a lot. Before reacting, I translated emotion, not words. I asked myself, what feeling is this sentence expressing? Safety, worry, care. When I answered that, my English responses became calmer and clearer. This habit is powerful. It shifts focus from correctness to connection. And connection is the real goal of language. Money means safety here, but that doesn't mean love is conditional. It means love is practical, grounded, willing to face reality without illusion. That kind of love isn't weaker. It's resilient. If you're learning English and struggling with topics that feel heavy, money, responsibility, future, don't avoid them. Approach them slowly. With simple words. With curiosity instead of defense. These conversations will teach you more English than comfortable small talk ever could. By the end of that week, I felt steadier. Not richer. Not more fluent. But more aligned with the environment I was living in. I stopped translating American culture into my old expectations and started meeting it where it was. And once that happened, something surprising occurred. Money stopped standing between us. It stood beside us. Like a quiet reminder that love isn't just about feelings, it's about building a life that can hold those feelings safely. Learning English through pain. Have you ever noticed that pain teaches faster than comfort ever could? Not the dramatic kind, no shouting, no tears, but the quiet pain that sits in your chest and refuses to leave. That was the kind of pain I carried after our first fight. And strangely, that was when my English started to change. I didn't plan it this way. I didn't wake up and say, "Today I will learn English through emotional discomfort." It happened because my brain had no choice. Avoiding the feeling didn't work anymore. Silence didn't protect me. So I did the only thing left. I put the pain into words. Very simple words. Most people think they lose motivation to learn English because they are bad at it. That's not true. They lose motivation because English becomes associated with stress. The brain is efficient. If something feels painful, it tries to avoid it. That's basic survival psychology. But here's the twist. When pain already exists, language can become relief instead of threat. After the fight, I felt heavy inside. Not angry. Not sad. Just tight. And that tightness followed me everywhere. While making coffee. While walking outside. While lying in bed staring at the ceiling. My thoughts were loud, but my English felt small. So I started talking to myself again. Slowly. Quietly. Not practicing grammar, processing emotion. I feel uncomfortable. I don't like this feeling. I'm scared to say the wrong thing. Short sentences. Present tense. Nothing impressive. But something interesting happened. Every time I named the pain, it softened a little. Neuroscience supports this. When you label an emotion, the brain's threat response decreases. Language literally calms the nervous system. That's when I realized something important. English didn't cause the pain. English was just standing nearby when pain arrived. And that meant English could also be part of the healing. I stopped avoiding difficult words. Not advanced vocabulary, emotional vocabulary. Words like worried, insecure, unsure, overwhelmed. These words are rarely taught early, but they are used constantly in real life. I practiced them. Slowly, out loud, without judgment. Pain also sharpened my listening. When emotions are involved, attention increases. I noticed tone more. Pauses. Breathing. I realized my partner wasn't speaking faster. I was listening slower because I was afraid. Once fear eased, comprehension returned. There's a concept in psychology called emotional salience. Information connected to emotion is remembered more strongly. That explains why I remembered sentences from difficult conversations more clearly than anything from a textbook. They mattered. They carried weight. One evening, I tried something brave. I spoke before I felt ready. I don't know how to talk about this yet, I said. Not fluent. Not smooth. But real. That sentence did two things. It protected me from pretending. And it invited patience. Pain turned into clarity. English turned into a bridge instead of a wall. Many learners think confidence comes first, then speaking. In reality, speaking creates confidence. Especially when you speak honestly. Even if your voice shakes. Even if your grammar limps. I also noticed how pain simplified my English. I stopped trying to sound correct. I aimed to sound clear. Clear English is slow English. Repetitive English. Human English. And that kind of English is perfect for learning. Pain has another strange effect. It narrows focus. I wasn't thinking about accent or mistakes anymore. I just wanted to be understood. That urgency cut through perfectionism. And perfectionism is one of the biggest enemies of language progress. That week, my motivation didn't feel exciting. It felt necessary. English became the only way to move forward emotionally. Avoiding it meant staying stuck. Using it, even imperfectly, meant release. I started noticing patterns. When I avoided English, the pain stayed abstract and heavy. When I spoke, even badly, the pain became specific, and therefore manageable. Specific pain is easier to carry than vague dread. This is a powerful lesson for anyone learning a language. Don't wait until you feel confident. Use the language to process discomfort. Say things like, "This is hard for me. I need time. I feel lost today." These sentences don't just communicate, they regulate emotion. By the end of that week, I wasn't happier. But I was lighter. Pain hadn't disappeared. It had transformed. It became information instead of noise. And English was the tool that made that transformation possible. If you're learning English and feeling stuck, ask yourself this: what emotion are you avoiding? Boredom, fear, shame. Language doesn't remove emotion, but it gives it shape. And once something has shape, you can work with it. Pain taught me that English isn't just for success stories. It's for confusion, for doubt, for uncomfortable honesty. And when you allow that, motivation stops being forced. It becomes natural. Because sometimes, the reason you need English most is when everything hurts just enough to make you speak. Talking, not avoiding. Have you ever noticed how avoiding a topic gives it more power than facing it ever could? That's what money became for us, an unspoken force sitting between two people who loved each other, but were afraid of the wrong sentence. By the 8th section of this journey, I learned a quiet truth. Avoidance feels safe, but talking is what actually brings relief. Avoidance has a logic. When something causes discomfort, the brain learns to step around it. This is basic conditioning. If a conversation leads to tension, your nervous system labels it as dangerous. So you stay quiet. You change the subject. You smile. On the outside, things look calm. Inside, pressure builds. That pressure was affecting my English more than I realized. When you avoid certain topics, you also avoid the vocabulary connected to them. Your language becomes smaller, safer, repetitive. And over time, that shrinkage feels like losing progress. But you're not losing ability, you're limiting exposure. One morning, I caught myself rehearsing silence. I was thinking ahead, planning which words not to use. That's when I knew something had to change. Language isn't meant to be edited before it exists. It's meant to be used, adjusted, refined in real time. So I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Just a small rule for myself. If something feels uncomfortable but important, I will talk about it using the simplest English possible. No explanations. No justifications. Just statements. That day, I practiced out loud before the conversation even happened. I feel nervous about money. I don't want to fight. I want us to understand each other. Short sentences. Calm pace. This preparation wasn't about controlling the conversation. It was about calming my body. When your body feels safe, your language flows better. That's physiology, not talent. When the moment came, I didn't wait for the perfect opening. I spoke early. Before tension grew. This is something American culture does well, addressing issues before they explode. It felt unnatural to me, but effective. The conversation was slower than usual. Pauses. Thinking time. Clarifying questions. But something important happened. We stayed connected. Talking didn't make things worse. Avoiding them had. Psychologically, this makes sense. Avoidance maintains anxiety. Exposure reduces it. The more you talk about something calmly, the less threatening it becomes. This applies to language learning too. When you speak about difficult topics in English, the language stops feeling fragile. I noticed my listening skills improving again. Not because the words were easier, but because my mind wasn't busy bracing for impact. Anxiety steals attention. Calm returns it. This experience changed how I practiced English overall. I stopped choosing easy topics and started choosing honest ones. Weather is easy. Feelings are honest. And honesty accelerates learning. There's research showing that emotionally meaningful content improves language retention. When words matter to you personally, your brain prioritizes them. That's why phrases like, I feel worried, stuck better than any random vocabulary list. Talking also revealed something surprising. My partner wasn't waiting to judge me. They were waiting to understand me. Avoidance had created distance that conversation quickly closed. From a relationship perspective, this was a turning point. We didn't solve everything, but we created a method. Talk early. Talk simply. Talk honestly. No long speeches. No emotional explosions. Just steady communication. From a language perspective, this was even bigger. English stopped being something I performed and became something I used. Performance requires perfection. Use requires intention. Intention is easier to sustain. I also learned to ask for support. Linguistically, saying, please speak slowly, or I need a moment, isn't weakness. It's strategy. It keeps communication alive instead of letting misunderstanding grow. Avoidance often disguises itself as politeness. But politeness without clarity becomes distance. Talking, even imperfectly, is an act of respect. If you're learning English and avoiding certain topics, because they feel too hard, ask yourself this. Are you protecting peace, or postponing clarity? Language grows when it touches real life. And real life includes money, fear, plans, and responsibility. By the end of this phase, money wasn't a monster anymore. It was just a topic. One of many. English wasn't heavy. It was functional. And my motivation returned, not as excitement, but as confidence. Confidence doesn't come from knowing what to say. It comes from trusting yourself to speak, even when you're unsure. Talking didn't fix everything, but it stopped the silent damage. And sometimes, that's the most important step forward. Family changes everything. Have you ever noticed how one single thought can suddenly rearrange all your priorities? Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, like furniture being moved in the dark. For me, that thought was simple: family changes everything. And once it entered my mind, money, English, love, and responsibility all shifted their positions. We weren't arguing anymore. We weren't avoiding conversations either. But something deeper was happening. I started thinking beyond us in the present moment. I started thinking forward. Children. Stability. A life that doesn't fall apart when something unexpected happens. In America, those thoughts arrive earlier than you expect. In many cultures, family is emotional first. You figure things out together as they come. In the US, family planning often begins before the crisis. Insurance, savings, education. These ideas aren't cold, they are protective. But when you're new, they can feel overwhelming, especially in another language. This shift affected my English in a surprising way. My vocabulary started changing. Less about feelings alone. More about systems. Words like future, responsibility, plan, support. These aren't romantic words, but they are family words here. Psychologically, this makes sense. When people think about children or long-term family, their time perspective expands. Researchers call this future-oriented thinking. It changes how the brain evaluates risk and effort. Suddenly, difficult conversations feel more necessary. Learning English feels less optional. I noticed my motivation shifting. Before, I learned English to survive daily life. Now, I learned English to protect a future I couldn't fully see yet. That kind of motivation is quieter but stronger. It doesn't rush. It doesn't burn out quickly. One evening, we talked about hypothetical scenarios. Not plans. Just what ifs. What if someone gets sick? What if costs increase? Important in that moment. Family conversations in America often sound practical, but they are deeply emotional underneath. Planning is how people express care. Talking about money isn't about control, it's about protection. This understanding softened my resistance completely. Money stopped feeling like a test of worth. It became a shared tool. And English became the way to hold that tool together. From a language learning perspective, family topics are powerful. They activate personal relevance, which strengthens memory. When you talk about people you care about, your brain pays attention. That's why learning English through family-related stories feels more natural and lasting. I started practicing English by imagining future situations. Speaking slowly. Simply. If we have children, I want them to feel safe. I want to be present. These sentences weren't about fluency. They were about values. And values give language weight. There's also a biological layer to this. Thinking about family increases oxytocin, a hormone associated with bonding and trust. That hormonal shift reduces anxiety, which improves language processing. In simple terms, when you feel connected, you communicate better. I also noticed a change in how I listened. I wasn't defensive anymore. I was curious. Curiosity is a powerful learning state. It opens the brain. instead of tightening it. Suddenly, English conversations felt less like challenges and more like collaboration. Family thinking also changed how I viewed mistakes. When the goal is protecting people you love, perfection loses importance. Progress matters more. I stopped apologizing for my English so much. I focused on being understood. This phase taught me that learning English isn't just about integrating into a society. It's about building a life that can grow. Family magnifies everything: joy, stress, responsibility. Language needs to be ready for that expansion. If you're learning English and feeling stuck, ask yourself who you're learning it for. Yourself, your partner, your children, your future self. When language connects to people, it stops feeling abstract. By the end of this stage, money conversations felt grounded. English felt purposeful. Love felt more realistic, not weaker, but stronger, because it included responsibility. Family didn't add pressure. It added clarity. It gave every conversation a reason. And once I saw that, motivation didn't need encouragement. It had direction. Because when you realize you're not just learning a language, but shaping a life, everything suddenly makes sense. Small actions, big relief. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by something so big that you forgot how powerful small actions can be? That was me after weeks of emotional tension, language fatigue, and quiet pressure. I kept thinking relief would come from a major breakthrough, a perfect conversation, a financial plan, fluent English. But real relief arrived quietly. Through small actions that didn't look impressive at all. In America, life moves fast on the surface, but it's built on routines underneath. Bills arrive monthly. Schedules repeat. Habits decide outcomes. Once I noticed this, I stopped waiting for motivation and started focusing on tiny, repeatable behaviors. Not to fix everything, just to lower the noise. The first small action was slowing my speech on purpose. Not because I was confused, but because my body needed time. I began adding pauses before responding. One breath. Then words. This simple pause reduced misunderstandings instantly. Neuroscience shows that a brief pause lowers cortisol and improves decision-making. In real life, it also improves English. The second action was choosing clarity over completeness. I stopped trying to explain everything. I used fewer words. Clear subject. Clear feeling. I'm worried. I need time. This helps me feel safe. These sentences became anchors. When conversations drifted, I returned to them. I also changed how I practiced listening. Instead of long sessions, I listened for 5 minutes, fully present. No multitasking. Just attention. Short, focused listening improves comprehension more than long distracted exposure. My brain felt less tired, and my understanding improved. At home, we created micro-habits around money conversations. Not big meetings. Just check-ins. Short. Calm. Predictable. Predictability matters. When your brain knows when a topic will appear, it stops scanning for danger all the time. Anxiety drops. Communication improves. One habit that helped surprisingly well was writing down one English sentence each day related to real life. Not fancy. Not motivational. Just true. Today felt heavy. I understood more. I spoke even though I was tired. Writing reinforced speaking. Speaking reinforced confidence. Confidence reduced stress. There's a psychological principle called behavioral activation. When motivation is low, action comes first. Small actions create feedback loops that rebuild energy. Waiting to feel ready keeps you stuck. Acting small moves you forward. I noticed changes. Quickly, not dramatic, but steady. Fewer misunderstandings. Less emotional residue after conversations. English felt usable again. Money felt manageable. Relief didn't arrive as happiness. It arrived as calm. Another small action was naming success correctly. I stopped measuring progress by fluency. I measured it by connection. Did we understand each other better today? Did I express one honest thought? That reframing changed everything. Success became frequent instead of rare. Culturally, this aligned with what I observed around me. Americans often improve systems through incremental changes. They adjust habits, not identities. That approach works for language learning too. You don't need a new personality. You need better routines. I also paid attention to my body. Hydration. Sleep. Warmth. These sound basic, but language is physical. When your body is regulated, your speech improves. When you're exhausted, even simple words feel heavy. Caring for the body is caring for communication. The relief grew because it was shared. Small actions invited cooperation. When I spoke slowly, others slowed down. When I asked for clarity, it appeared. Communication is reciprocal. Your pace sets the tone. If you're learning English and everything feels heavy, don't chase big motivation. Build small relief. Choose one sentence. One pause. One habit. Repeat it until your nervous system trusts the process. By the end of this phase, nothing magical had happened. No sudden fluency. No perfect agreement. But the air felt lighter. Conversations ended without tension. English fit into daily life again, instead of standing apart from it. Small actions didn't solve everything. They made space for solutions to exist. And sometimes, that's all relief really is, space. Love can talk about money. Have you ever believed that if love is real, it shouldn't need explanations? I believed that for a long time. I thought love should be intuitive, gentle, almost silent about practical things. Money, especially, felt like a dangerous topic, too sharp for something as soft as affection. But by the 11th step of this journey, I finally understood. Something simple and uncomfortable. Love that can't talk about money isn't fragile because of money, it's fragile because of silence. This realization didn't arrive with confidence. It arrived with honesty. Quiet honesty. The kind that shows up after you're tired of misunderstanding each other. By this point, money was no longer the center of our attention. It was still there, of course. But it no longer carried emotional weight. And that's when I noticed the shift. Love didn't feel smaller after we talked about money. It felt clearer. In American culture, communication is often direct, not because people lack sensitivity, but because clarity is seen as care. Ambiguity creates risk. Risk creates stress. Talking reduces both. Once I understood this value system, money conversations stopped feeling like confrontations and started feeling like cooperation. Psychologically, this aligns with attachment theory. Secure relationships are built on predictability and transparency. When expectations are clear, the nervous system relaxes. That relaxation allows affection to flow more freely. Love feels safer when it's grounded. I noticed how my English reflected this change. My sentences became calmer, less defensive. I stopped over-explaining. I used neutral language. This matters to me. I need to understand this. Let's look at it together. These weren't dramatic statements, but they carried stability. One night, we talked about money without any emotional charge at all. No tight chest. No racing thoughts. Just facts, preferences, and mutual respect. And afterward, something surprising happened. We laughed. Not because the topic was funny, but because the tension was gone. Love had space again. This taught me a powerful lesson. For English learners, fluency isn't about sounding natural. It's about feeling safe enough to be direct. When you stop hiding your meaning, your language simplifies naturally. That's real progress. I also realized how much energy avoidance had cost me. Avoiding money talk didn't protect love. It drained it. Silence required constant monitoring, what not to say, how to react, when to change the subject. Talking, on the other hand, required courage once, then gave peace repeatedly. There's a cognitive concept called decision fatigue. The more you avoid decisions, the more exhausted you become. Open conversations remove hidden decisions. They free mental space. That space can then be used for connection, creativity, and learning. From a language perspective, talking about money forced me to use real-life English. Not scripted. Not rehearsed. Real sentences with real consequences. That kind of practice accelerates growth, because it's meaningful. Meaning beats repetition. Every time. I also noticed something subtle but important. Love didn't become transactional when money entered the conversation. It became intentional. We weren't measuring affection. We were aligning values. Alignment is deeply romantic, even if it doesn't look like it in movies. In many stories, love conquers everything without effort. Real life is different. Love cooperates with reality. It adapts. It learns new languages, emotional and verbal. And sometimes, it has to say numbers out loud. For anyone learning English through stories like this, remember, avoiding hard topics doesn't make your English gentle. It makes it incomplete. Real fluency includes the ability to talk about responsibility, fear, plans, and yes, money. By the end of this stage, I no longer saw money conversations as tests of love. I saw them as expressions of trust. You don't plan with someone you don't believe in. You don't talk about the future with someone you don't see yourself staying with. That understanding changed everything. English felt lighter. Love felt steadier. Life in America felt less foreign. If you're afraid to talk about money, in English or any language, ask yourself what you're really protecting. Romance? Or comfort with avoidance? Because real intimacy isn't about protecting illusions. It's about sharing reality. Love can talk about money. Not because love is weak, but because love is strong enough to face life as it is. And once you accept that, conversations stop being scary. They become bridges. Love is not a guessing game. For a long time, I treated love like a puzzle I had to solve quietly. I believed that if I paid close enough attention to tone, timing, silence, I could understand everything without asking. Asking felt risky. It felt like admitting weakness, or worse, creating tension where none existed. So I guessed. And I called it intuition. But intuition without confirmation is just assumption. By the 12th stage of this journey, I finally learned a difficult truth. Love is not a guessing game. It's a conversation. And conversations require questions. This realization came slowly. Not through conflict, but through exhaustion. I was tired of interpreting pauses. Tired of replaying conversations in my head. Tired of wondering what something really meant. That mental effort was invisible, but it was heavy. In psychology, there's a concept called mind reading, a common cognitive distortion. It happens when we assume we know what others think or feel without evidence. In relationships, mind reading feels romantic at first, like deep connection. But over time, it becomes a source of misunderstanding. I saw this clearly when learning English. When I guessed the meaning of a word instead of asking, I sometimes got lucky. But often, I misunderstood. And those misunderstandings stacked up. The same thing happened in love. One day, I noticed how Americans ask questions more directly than I was used to. Not aggressively. Not rudely. Just clearly. What do you mean by that? How do you feel about this? Can you help me understand? These questions weren't signs of insecurity. They were signs of engagement. That shifted something inside me. I realized that guessing was actually a way of avoiding responsibility. If I guessed wrong, I could blame confusion. If I asked and heard the truth, I had to respond to it. Questions create clarity, but clarity requires courage. The first time I chose to ask instead of guess, my heart raced. My English felt simple, almost childish. Short sentences. Careful words. But the result surprised me. Nothing broke. No tension exploded. Instead, the air felt cleaner. The answer I received wasn't dramatic. It didn't solve everything instantly. But it was real. And reality, even when imperfect, is grounding. From a language learning perspective, this was a breakthrough. Questions are powerful tools. They turn passive understanding into active communication. When you ask, you participate. You stop being a silent observer of your own life. I began to notice how often stories, especially romantic ones, glorify silent understanding. Two people look at each other and magically know everything. That image is beautiful, but it's incomplete. In real life, silence leaves too much room for fear. Fear fills gaps quickly. And rarely kindly. In American culture, clarity is often valued over subtlety. That doesn't mean emotions are shallow. It means emotions are expressed through words rather than expectations. Once I understood that, asking questions felt less like intrusion and more like respect. There's also a neurological reason. This matters. Uncertainty activates the brain's threat system. Clear information calms it. When you ask and receive answers, your body relaxes. You breathe differently. You listen better. Love feels safer. I noticed this shift in my English fluency too. When I stopped guessing meanings and started asking, my progress accelerated. Not because my vocabulary grew overnight, but because my confidence did. Confidence grows from permission, the permission to not know yet. In relationships, the same rule applies. You don't need to know everything instinctively. You just need permission to ask. Of course, asking questions doesn't guarantee comfort. Sometimes answers hurt. Sometimes they challenge your hopes. But guessing doesn't protect you from pain, it just delays it. And delayed pain often grows. I also learned that how you ask matters. Tone matters. Intention matters. Asking to understand feels different from asking to accuse. In English, this is reflected in phrasing. Can you help me understand? Feels open. Why did you do that? Can feel sharp. Language shapes emotional outcomes. This awareness made me more careful, but also more effective. I wasn't just learning English. I was learning relational literacy. By the end of this section of my journey, I stopped romanticizing silent endurance. I stopped believing that love meant never needing clarification. Instead, I began to see questions as invitations to honesty, to closeness, to shared reality. Love doesn't fail because people ask too many questions. It fails because people stop asking the right ones. If you're learning English through real stories, remember this: questions are not interruptions. They are bridges. They connect what you assume to what is true. And love, like language, thrives in truth, not in guesses. So ask. Even if your voice shakes. Even if your grammar isn't perfect. Even if the answer scares you. Because love is not a guessing game. It's a dialogue. And dialogue is where understanding begins. By now, you may have realized something important. This story is not only about love. It is about how we understand others, and how we understand ourselves. Because in both love and learning English, we often guess instead of asking, stay silent instead of speaking, and hope someone else will understand what we never clearly expressed. But as you've heard throughout this story, misunderstandings don't come from weak language, but from silence. Real progress doesn't come from knowing everything, but from having the courage to ask. If this story feels familiar, if you are learning English, but still feel afraid to speak, Afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of not being good enough. Remember this. Every confident speaker once started with very simple sentences. And here's the beautiful part. This journey doesn't end here. In the next video on this channel, you will continue walking with the main character into a moment that tests everything they believe. When the truth is spoken too late, can love and understanding still be saved? In the next episode, you will practice slow, clear English listening, reading, and speaking. Learn real-life vocabulary through meaningful stories. Discover how to express emotions naturally in English. And most importantly, build real confidence when speaking English. If you don't want to miss the next part of this story, if you truly want to improve your English every day without pressure, subscribe to the channel now. Like this video if the story touched you. Comment one simple English sentence you liked the most today. And turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Because English is not just a language. It is the way you tell your own story to the world. And that story has only just begun. See you in the next story.